All right, let's get some perspective now. And we're joined for this conversation by independent analyst Khaya Sithole. We're also hoping to be joined by Redge Nkosi, another person who is well-versed on this particular issue. But let's start with Khaya Sithole, who has joined us for the conversation. Mr. Sithole, thank you very much for your time. Would it be too cynical? All right, there, Reggie also joining us. Welcome, Reggie. Let me start with you, Khaya. Is it too cynical to raise the timing of the release of this report by the Reserve Bank?
Good morning to the viewers. Yeah, I think that is a bit too cynical because from what we know, the Reserve Bank says they only finished the investigation a couple of weeks ago and they've only released it now. And the reason this theory that they've timed it in order to capitalize on the distraction, as it were, of the BRICS summit is actually quite ironic because it then turns out that the BRICS summit is the type of summit where there are so many foreign dignitaries and foreign business persons who have arrived in the country who definitely have some elements of foreign currency. So it would not be in the interest of the country or the Reserve Bank to then say, oh, by the way, here's an alert that you can get away with violating exchange control regulations if you find these particular loopholes. So I don't think they would have timed it at this particular week. It's simply a matter of they've finished the process and they're to release the report.
Yeah. Reggie, let's come to you. A lot of the reaction that we have heard so far, the complaints range from this is too cryptic from the Reserve Bank. We can't make sense of this. Others are saying it feels like a cover-up. What's your perspective?
Well, it is almost a cover-up, Cody. I think the Reserve Bank should have been a lot more clearer, should have been circumspect around this particular matter. The President is a very senior-ranking citizen. And this issue of mighty public interest, frankly, there should have been, a lot more clearer to us, telling us in a liner that, the President and the company have been absolved from this issue is quite frankly not acceptable. By the way, the country is not interested as to whether there was the contractual terms between the President and whoever the buyer was were consummated or not. The country is interested about whether the money was indeed in the President's house and where that money came from and how it arrived there and where that money is. Not as to whether it was perfected, a transaction was perfected. But what we want to know is whether the money came in and why that money came in. Full stop. The rest is complete hogwash.
Sure. Khaya Sithole, let's come to you. I don't think that there is any doubt about the money being at the President's farm because there has been a public admission to that effect. The question is, what are the rules when someone or when a citizen comes into the possession of foreign currency? What does the law say?
Well, in simple terms, the regulation that the Reserve Bank cited yesterday says that within 30 days of a person being entitled to that element of foreign currency, they then have to pass it on to either the Treasury or to an authorized dealer. So that is the law as we understand it. The crux of the matter here seems to be the question of when or if ever the President or indeed the farm ever became entitled to the foreign currency that was there in their premises. And of course, according to the Reserve Bank statement yesterday, then the 30-day countdown would have started at the point in time where they became entitled to that amount of money. And what they have said yesterday is that as far as they have assessed the nature of the transaction, there were still conditions that were not fulfilled at the point in time that they obviously did the investigation. And until those conditions are indeed fulfilled, neither the President nor the farm have essentially become unconditionally entitled to the amount of money. So therefore, according to the Reserve Bank, the clock doesn't start until you reach that particular hurdle. Now, of course, the problem with that particular proposition is that it will definitely surprise a lot of citizens, mainly because from what we've seen in the public discourse about this particular transaction, it's definitely not the most sophisticated transaction in history. It definitely hasn't been buttressed by some sophisticated contracts that make it very difficult for people to assess whether the transaction is being finalized or not. Yeah. So in this particular instance, there was common consent that the animals had not been delivered. So if the Reserve Bank is to persist with the view that, well, the mere lack of delivery of the animals means the transaction is pending, it is difficult to then reconcile how it could take them an entire year to work around that, because it was a matter that was known from inception that the animals have not been delivered. And if it is the case for us saying that Regulation 6.1 does not come into play, it's a matter of weeks of deliberating rather than an entire year.
Reggie, let's come to you. You have said that the Reserve Bank has absolved the president. I suspect that there could be a question mark there. And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. The Reserve Bank says this about the facts available before it. And I quote now, the transaction was not fulfilled and therefore there was no legal entitlement to the foreign currency. I'm going to try and put that in simple English the way that I understand it, but you are the fundi here, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong. The Reserve Bank is saying there was no transaction to investigate. Therefore, they have very little to say. What are they trying to do here? Are they trying to absolve themselves from this matter? Never mind the absolution of the president.
It seems to me they're trying to absolve themselves. They say there's no transaction, but what we know is the president received the money. Okay? So there ought to be a transaction. I mean, a transaction gets fulfilled when there's a transfer between parties of goods. All right. One of that money, a commodity, is being transferred to the president. Whether the other person has received delivery of the other goods is immaterial here. The point here is a country has received foreign currency in the regions of 580,000, at least according to the president. According to the spy bosses, about $4 million. That is sufficient ground to say if the country received $4 million it received $4 million for more than a month, that should have been declared. A transaction is sufficient. We do not have to wait for a consummation of the contract.
Yeah.
That the other person must pick up the money, the cows or whatever they are, and take them off. The idea here is to investigate that what is found in the country, whether it is in the country legally or not. So the Reserve Bank is trying to pull itself out of this through some technicality that, quite frankly, can be challenged, in my view.
Okay.
And indeed, legal minds would challenge that.
Okay. So, Khaya, let's come to you. And again, Reggie mentions 4 million rands, or is it $4 million? I'm not quite sure, but I think the amount that was stated was an amount of 580,000 US dollars, which is the equivalent of $11 million in South Africa. I mean, 11 million rand in South African currency. I'm trying to get us to, the facts here. Is there something to be said, Khaya, about transactions that are made not via the banks, but that are made in cash? And should there be a focused look now on these types of transactions?
Yeah, so there are a couple of intersectional issues here. The first one is simply the question of perhaps the legal gaps that exist here. The legal gaps start from the process of how the currency made its way into the country. So, of course, if the currency made its way into a country from a foreigner, like Mr. Mustafa is now known to be, it's actually a matter of what happened at the point of entry, which would have been OR Tambo on the day that they arrived around Christmas in 2019. And, of course, Home Affairs would have been responsible for actually overseeing that element of it. And, of course, had it been detected to be carrying this amount of foreign currency, then there would have been a question of declaration and the question of what the purpose is supposed to be. Clearly, the fact that we've now been told that SARS cannot find evidence of those declarations means that we already had a gap there. And in fact, the problem that emerges from that is that until the money was stolen and until Mr. Arthur Fraser told us about it, the Reserve Bank was none the wiser about the fact that the money existed in the country in the first place. So that's clearly a problem of the legal systems that either overlap or also bypass each other rather than coordinate these parts of activities. So that's, for me, is the bigger issue that we need to be able to figure out how to deal with more comprehensively. The question of why people still transact in foreign currency within a country is probably a matter of some of these markets actually are known for doing these types of activities. So game farming and game trading in particular is actually laden with transactions that are conducted in this nature. Now, whether we should outlaw these transactions, given the fact that we've now seen that there are clearly particular gaps that create compliance issues, that's a matter that you would have thought the Reserve Bank would take the lead in championing to say, well, actually, perhaps there should be a case study of some of the limitations and the loopholes that exist in the law. So therefore, let us revisit that regime. And if it turns out that we need to ban the ability of private citizens to conduct foreign currency transactions within the border, then perhaps that's the easiest way, which simply says when you arrive at the point of entry with foreign currency, you must convert it into South African rands in order to execute private transactions. Otherwise, there must be a different way in which this amount of cash is dealt with. And this is the problem that we have here.
Yeah. Reggie, Khaya talks about the Reserve Bank needing to take the lead, not only educating South Africans, but also, I think, doing the most important element about all of this, and that is transparency. So earlier, I spoke about a report they released. That actually is not factual, because what they have given us is a very terse media statement where they have extrapolated certain conclusions. But they have said that the report will be kept private. Can we say from just that kind of action from the Reserve Bank that this is an institution that is interested in being transparent to the South African public?
It's rather difficult for us to have to conclude whether it is indeed interested in that or not. The point here is that they have to follow some laws, there's no doubt. However, the person in the issue here is the senior citizen of the country. Now, this issue is of mighty public interest. Therefore, there may be need for the Reserve Bank, whatever the laws that are there, to shed some light on the matter. However, the Reserve Bank has chosen not to do that for reasons known to itself. Remember, the SARS had an opportunity to give us some sense of it. Of course, they say the President did give them an okay. But even here, this issue is of mighty public interest to the extent that the Reserve Bank would have given us a lot more sense as to what is happening or what happened. Now, to wait for the governor to tell us when he gets to Parliament is insufficient. The Reserve Bank would have issued a report that's good enough for the citizens to understand. However, today, they've chosen to be quiet. Remember, this is a monetary policy and exchange control issue. Matters that are within the Preserve the Reserve Bank mandate. To the extent that this is part of their mandate, frankly, there are ways in which they can educate the public than the way they've chosen right now, in a single liner almost. The rest of the 2 pages is quite frankly not helpful. It's just a liner which says, well, therefore they don't find both the Inyoni and the President having contravened somehow. Yeah. Frankly, this is not enough.
Khaya Sithole, the public interest element, as we conclude this conversation, the public interest element, it would seem, is something that is going to be fought here because opposition parties are already up in arms. And I'm using that argument based on what we have already seen from the country's former senior first citizen, former President Jacob Zuma, his tax affairs. There has been a consistent effort to say something needs to be unearthed about former President Jacob Zuma's tax affairs. Surely this should apply to President Cyril Ramaphosa, particularly given the fact that he is the same person who told us just a few days ago, during the 40th anniversary of the UDF, that companies should not seek to hide their profits by evading tax. Is he not doing the same?
So it's a bit of an interesting dimension in that we have to distinguish between matters that are in the public interest versus the type of issue that emerged in the SARS case involving Amapungane and former President Jacob Zuma. In relation to that particular case, it was simply a matter of whether an organization like Amapungane can actually demand to have access onto taxpayer information, and SARS's position was that the law prevents them from doing that. And of course, what the Constitutional Court has said that, well, actually you need to revisit some of these laws because they may be at odds with the idea of public accountability and public transparency. When the president talks about, the current president talks about the need for companies to obviously make sure that they pay their own taxes, they pay their due taxes to the fiscus, that's a matter of public policy, and also that's a matter of, the type of legal compliance that all companies must face. What we now are dealing with is a question of whether the Reserve Bank in particular, or even the president himself, think that it's important for the public to have a much better understanding of what has happened here. Because, of course, a terse press statement that then leaves more confusions means that many more people are now going to be unsure about exactly what the rules are around the movement of foreign currency and the custody of foreign currency. So I think for me in this case, the primary public interest is essentially the information that the public needs to have in order to be able to understand how the Reserve Bank reaches conclusions. We may agree or we may disagree with their conclusions, but it's important for us to understand the process. And I think in this case, that has been their big misstep in that they've created an information blackout that leaves people like us to have to speculate about it, which is not particularly helpful given the fact that you want as many people to comply with the laws of the Republic. Right now, nobody seems to know where the lines are to be drawn, and that is disappointing.
And it is exactly on that point that I want to conclude this conversation, Redge Nkosi, what Khaya Sithole has just said, that this, in a way, is tantamount to information blackout. This entire process has been steeped in technicalities. And I am asking this question to you. Were it an ordinary South African like you and me, would these institutions have done exactly the same process in order to bring out such conclusions? Were it an ordinary citizen?
Sadly not. They wouldn't. They would in fact have taken us to jail immediately after 30 days, given the period that's allowed in law to declare this money. Now, it is the president here, mind you, and institutions of the Reserve Bank are not immune from political pressure. They may call themselves independent. They're never independent in the first place. And we have seen right now, and we see it right in our eyes, in the manner the statement has been issued, is terse, is in fact, quite frankly, an uninformed statement. No one can get anything from it. So it is indeed a political game that the Reserve Bank is playing. It's not independent. It's not in the national interest. And quite frankly, a disappointment for an institution of the nature of the Reserve Bank. But anyway, to most of us, it's not, because the Reserve Bank is at the center of the mess, the economic mess that we find ourselves here. And now at the political mess that South Africa finds itself. Frankly, you and me as ordinary citizens wouldn't be in this setup at all. We would be languishing in jail.
Redge Nkosi, Executive Director at Firstsource Money, and Khaya Sithole, thanks indeed for your inputs here. He is an independent analyst. Well, are you any clearer about this entire saga? We are going to have to watch the space here.